This is McGregor's Travel Adventures audio tour guide to the Vatican Museums. Use this audio guide with the accompanying slideshow to help you navigate from point to point and to view pictures to better illustrate the items you're viewing. The main focus of this tour is the Sistine Chapel, although the Stanza Raffaello and a few other works will be considered before we arrive there. Unless you're a professional museum goer, the hour or two that we spend with these few sites is going to be enough to overload your tolerance levels. If you want to concentrate on items other than those I've listed, I would suggest a different audio tour. The entrance to this museum is in what used to be known as the Belvedere Palace, the Pope's summer home. Belvedere means beautiful view. After you get through the Pinecone Courtyard, a 2,000-year-old sweating fountain found near the Pantheon, and go up the stairs to begin the tour, take a second and look out the window to the right at the top of the stairs. That's the Belvedere. The Apollo Belvedere. Here is a sculpture from the early 2nd century Rome, but which is a copy of a now lost brass original from Greece some 4 centuries before that. Don't know where it's been all the time, but since Pope Julius II, the guy that hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine, put it on display in the early 1500s, it's been all the rage. When the famous German art historian and archaeologist Winkelmann whispered that it was the best example of perfection of the Greek aesthetic ideal, the Enlightenment world listened, including the lights of Goethe and Schiller, who in turn sang its praises. Napoleon liked it so much he took it back to the Louvre with him as a postcard, but it was returned here after he fell from power. Despite its noticeable emasculation and froofy topknot, men and women have been admiring it for centuries. You'll note the quiver strapped to his back. Since he's the god of the hunt, he apparently used to have a freshly drawn arrow in his right hand, while his left hand held aloft an aimed bow. Art historians will fill your ear with the fact that this is the original contrapposto. He's not just standing there, but telegraphs in his still frame the memory of movement. Unlike other steroid-pumped heroes like the Laocoon on the other corner of this room, he's strong but lithe, smooth as a baby's bottom. Trivia fact: Michelangelo used Apollo's face as model for his Jesus in the Final Judgment. Laocoon. This is one of the most famous statues in ancient history. We actually know of it from writings of Pliny the Elder. He said that this work was, quote, a work that may be looked upon as preferable to any other production of the art of painting or of statuary, unquote. Apparently, he had described it so well that when it was unearthed in 1506, everybody immediately knew that it was the statue that he had described. Michelangelo was one of those that eagerly watched it come out of the earth. This massive torso will be reiterated over and over again in his resurrected Savior and saints in the Final Judgment. The story depicted here is the story of the priest of Troy and his 2 sons, who, seeing the great wooden horse the Greeks had left before the gates, is quoted as saying, "Don't trust the horse, Trojans, whatever it is, I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts." The Greek gods heard him and first tried to dissuade the Trojans from listening to him by sending an earthquake, but when they continued to wheel the horse into the gates and Laocoon begged to have it burned, Poseidon sent 2 sea serpents to strangle him and his sons. The Belvedere Torso. According to the Vatican Museums website, this quintuplegic stump of marble's, quote, most favored hypothesis identifies it with Ajax, the son of Telamon, in the act of contemplating his suicide, unquote. But the animal hide upon which it is seated may actually identify it as Hercules. It is ancient, either original Greek or Roman copy, that was unearthed sometime in the 15th century, but it came to light when Michelangelo was beginning his career. He must have seen it while very young, because his whole life was spent copying it in one form or another. Before his time, statues didn't twist. They didn't put their weight on one foot. They just stood there in all their glory, like someone playing at statues. Note the twist of the torso, the splay of the legs, the stretch of the arms, the cocking of the head. You're going to see this again and again and again when you see the inuti in the Sistine Chapel. You now have a very long walk down a hall past priceless treasures that, because of the constraints on your time, I won't talk about. So as you're herded along with all the other tourists toward the Sistine Chapel, let me take this time to fill you in on some of the history of that place. The Sistine Chapel. The Pope and his massive household or staff are responsible for many religious services throughout the year. While many of them are public, most are private and require a space away from prying eyes. Hence, right next to the largest church in the world that is dotted with chapels and altars, another chapel was built. Long before the current edifice was built, there was another chapel of roughly the same size, but due to the marshy ground, by the mid-15th century, it was, quote, in a ruinous state with its walls leaning, unquote. So they ripped it down, built this one, and named it after Pope Sixtus IV. When we say Sistine, we're really saying belonging to Sixtus. A quick side note. Numeric praenomia. You may have noticed all the Roman names referring to numbers. Quintilis, Sextus, Septimus, Octavian, and etc. Like us, Romans had 3 names. The first name was used only by friends and family, the second on public records, and the third was the family name. The numeric praenomia were ancient, even by Roman standards. It is not known exactly how they were used. Some think it was birth order, others the number of the month in which they were born. But who knows? It may have been more like Trace Houston, the third Daniel Houston. Anyway, that's how you get a guy named Pope Six IV. All you're going to see is the interior of the chapel itself, and that's more than enough. But just know that there is a significant basement beneath your feet. Also, know that while painting the ceiling, Michelangelo was probably bothered now and again by the tramp of feet above him. Yep, there's a wardrobe for the Swiss guards up there. As a matter of fact, the place was built to be defended. There's an overhanging balustrade and gangway up above the windows. But since invading Visigoths are now few, the gangway has been roofed over, but nevertheless, the place still looks like a fort from the exterior. The most notable thing that goes on here is that this is where the College of Cardinals meets to decide who the next pope is going to be. Yes, there's a conclave, but no, they're not locked in here like in the movies. There are nice apartments down the hall for the cardinals to stay in when the long day of politicking has concluded, along with dining and restroom facilities, I assume. If you're looking for where the oven is that they burn the ballots in, to send the smoke up the chimney to announce an unsuccessful ballot, less than 2/3 majority equals black smoke, or the election of a new pope, white smoke, you won't see it anywhere. It's installed for the conclave and then put away somewhere, probably in that massive basement. When the chapel was first built, the walls were completely decorated with mural frescoes by some extremely famous people, Perugino, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and others. It's a testament to the genius of Michelangelo that nobody even speaks of them in here, yeah? When we get to the actual art, I'll point out names and artists so they won't be shortchanged in our visit at least. But the ceiling was pretty plain back in those days. I mean, who paints frescoes on a ceiling? It was a simple blue ceiling, probably more toward navy than royal blue, spangled with painted stars, probably gilded. Prior to the actual building of St. Peter's Basilica by Bramante, Michelangelo had been the Pope's favorite artist while they schemed about the Pope's tomb project. But when Bramante took center stage, Michelangelo ran away in a snit of rage and hid out in Firenze for several months. The Pope sent messengers, letters, and finally a papal decree to get him to come back to Rome. But although the Pope loved him and wanted him near, Bramante didn't want him anywhere near the works. He convinced the Pope to assign Michelangelo the painting of the ceiling, a task he assumed he either wouldn't accept or fail completely at, necessitating the Pope to hire Raphael, Bramante's darling, to do the task. But Bramante turned out to be too clever by half. Michelangelo had painted only one fresco in his life, and that as a student. He begged and pleaded and whined and moaned, "I am not a painter. Let me sculpt." But the Pope had the final word, and Michelangelo pulled on his boots and went to work. Apparently his boss, Bramante, had rigged a scaffold for him, but ever the paranoid artist, Michelangelo didn't trust it. He thought it was set up to kill him. So he engineered his own, with brackets attached to the walls just above the windows. That way services could continue in the chapel below, while he spent 4 years up there in the rafters. No, he did not lay on his back. He stood up and craned his neck. And he didn't work alone. His assistants were responsible for such tasks as moving the scaffold, chipping off and carting away the old ceiling plaster, preparing the new surface, mixing and applying the fresco plaster for the day's painting, and transferring the cartoon to the surface. When the master would step in and apply his paints, I'm sure the assistants were still around to help with pigments and palettes, going out for lunch, and probably other more gross tasks, because once he got up there, Michelangelo stayed up there all freaking day and into the night if necessary. He also didn't let anyone, not even the Pope, see his work before it was done. He kept a tarp under the scaffold, presumably leaving the tarp and adding new ones as he progressed along the ceiling. It's to keep the paint drops from falling on the heads of the cardinals, I'm sure he said. But it was actually him guarding his work until he was ready. The Pope cajoled him incessantly until once he did give him a peek, but just a peek. But at least one more person snuck in and got a glimpse one day, but more about that later. While you're still walking down the hall, let me give you a preview of the frescoes painted by other artists on the side walls of the Sistine Chapel before you actually get there. If you want, you can take a quick peek at the pictures provided in the slideshow. The frescoes on the walls were originally meant to be the final artwork of the chapel. As noted, the ceiling was just painted blue and gold, not meant to be really noticed at all. And so we have frescoes by extremely famous and capable artists with incredible detail telling important doctrinal stories. The panels on one side, depending on which way you're facing, tell the stories of Moses from the Torah. Mirroring them on the other wall are stories of the New Testament. Many of them also symbolically mirror each other in subject matter. At the front, we start with 2 murals by Perugino, depicting the circumcision of Moses' son and the baptism of Christ, ordinances that, according to the 5th century Augustine, were spiritual mirrors of each other. Next are 2 murals by the incomparable Botticelli, the Trials of Moses, facing the temptation of Christ. Note Moses protecting his future wife and sisters-in-law at the well of Midian, and Christ and Satan on the top of a very 14th century-looking church or temple. Next in line, are more somber hues, are Ghirlandaio's Crossing of the Red Sea and the Calling of the Apostles. I don't have a clue how these two are supposed to be related, but then maybe the contract to paint matching subjects was more of a suggestion than an actual rule. The only unifying factor I can find is that they both depict bodies of water. The next 2 panels may be by the same artist, Rosselli, but the attribution is a little fuzzy, not to mention totally different color palettes. The subject matter is easy to correlate, however. On the one side is Moses bringing his law of obedience and sacrifice down from Mount Sinai, while Christ preaches the law of the gospel from his Sermon on the Mount. I find it interesting that the painters seem to know more about the gospel than the latter-day interpreters of the paintings. For example, the next 2 scenes, one by Botticelli, the other by Perugino, are called The Punishment of the Rebels and The Keys of the Kingdom, respectively. Such titles leave most scratching their head, but the discerning eye will see that Perugino knew something more about the priesthood than do modern art scholars. When you get a chance, see if you can read what is written on the triumphal arch in the Torah panel. No man takes this honor unto himself, save he that was called of God. The discerning doctrinaire will be able to contrast the Levitical priesthood of old and the priesthood given to Peter in the new. The death of Moses and the Last Supper, done by less well-known artists, is an obvious statement and restatement of the death of the leader of the church. Finally, note the 2 panels on the back wall depicting the disputation over the body of Moses on the right and the resurrection of Christ on the left. Never heard of the disputation? Well, read Jude verse 9 in the New Testament, but you won't be much the wiser after doing so. Anyway, these two murals were in a completely different style than the high Renaissance murals on the chapel sides. The original murals were destroyed when parts of the wall collapsed in 1522 and were subsequently repainted some 50 years later, when the artists had taken up a new style of painting. Also note the absence of the murals from this series on the front wall. Those frescoes, contrasting the finding of Moses and the Nativity, were destroyed on purpose when Michelangelo painted his final judgment. We are going to disregard the next level of paintings above the murals from the Testaments. They depict various famous popes who lived prior to the building of the Sistine Chapel. When Pope Julius II had designed the painting in the chapel, he had wanted the ceiling to depict the lives of the 12 apostles. The depiction of the popes, then, would have been a pictorial line of authority, claiming the succession of priesthood authority from the apostles to the bishops of Rome. But when the assertive Michelangelo was hired to do the job, he couldn't bring himself to paint a bunch of old dead white men standing around, and changed the entire program. I'm pretty sure that while some of it may have come from his own obstinacy, as you will see in our study of what he did paint, the subject matter that is there is at least inspired, if not revealed. It's time now to discuss the Stanza Raffaello, the next stop on your tour. If you haven't arrived there yet, please pause this audio guide until you get to them. The Stanza Raffaello. These rooms were originally intended as a suite of apartments for Pope Julius II. In 1508, he commissioned Raphael, then a relatively young artist, to redecorate the existing interiors of the rooms entirely. It was possibly Julius' intent to outshine the apartments of his predecessor and rival, Pope Alexander VI, as the stanze are directly above Alexander Borgia's apartment. If you really wanted to get into history and biography, you could spend hours in this room showing how the person standing in this historical figure was either a friend or foe of Pope Julius II, but since you don't know and don't care, we won't go there. The first room is the Sala di Costantino. It has 4 frescoes that depict mythic, historic events in the life of Constantine the Great. You just can't get away from this guy. One of them is accurate, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where Maxentius foolishly led his army out from behind the walls of Rome to a battleground with the Tiber at his rear. The bridge was wooden, but it was from there that Maxentius fell and drowned in the river, allowing Constantine to claim total victory. The vision of the cross depicts what happened the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in which Constantine is purported to have seen a sign in the heavens and heard a voice saying, "In this sign conquer." But this was actually a very personal experience, not the fantastical scene envisioned here, and what he saw was not a Latin cross, but the Chi Rho, which you can see pictured in the slideshow. The other 2 scenes are totally fictional. The baptism of Constantine actually took place just a few days before Constantine died, way over in Constantinople, and in a private ceremony. The man was dying, after all. The donation of Constantine was a mythical event in which the emperor supposedly gave the pope deed and title over the Western Empire. This supposed letter documenting the donation had already been proven a forgery by the time this had been painted. But alternative facts. The next room is the Stanza de Eliodoro. It has 2 paintings about subjects you really wouldn't know or care about: the Maccabean expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple and the Mass at Bolsena. The meeting of Leo the Great and Attila has a little historical pull for us, as it depicts the strange end of Attila's raids into Italy in the early 5th century. But the one you might have a few moments' interest in is the deliverance of St. Peter. This masterful use of space and the size of the characters makes it very approachable. The next room is the Stanza della Segnatura and contains one of the probably 10 most famous paintings in the world. This room shows the 4 areas of human knowledge: philosophy, religion, poetry, and the law. But the most famous of all paintings here is the School of Athens. While the setting is supposed to be ancient Greece, it is actually the unfinished crossing of St. Peter's, just 50 yards from here in reality. The names of each of the subjects is well known, but the faces don't belong to them. They were dead 2,000 years. Instead, like all the other paintings in this place, Raphael used the faces of well-known figures. For example, it doesn't take too much for even the untrained eye to see that the central old man representing Plato is actually Leonardo da Vinci. At some point while painting this, Raphael was able to sneak into the Sistine Chapel, just a few yards from here, when Michelangelo was out. He was so overcome with the project that he realized he had to include the figure of Michelangelo among the geniuses. You'll see him, his brooding face, broken nose, and signature boots playing the prickly Heraclitus at the foot of the steps in front of Plato Leonardo. Raphael's mentor is standing in as Euclid, the father of geometry, the one demonstrating a compass on wax board to a rapt group of students in the lower right. The second from the last figure whose gaze breaks the fourth wall is none other than Raphael himself, already confidently among the geniuses. Other paintings in this room include the Parnassus, which takes on the job of depicting the fine arts with Apollo, the 9 muses, and the 9 poets of antiquity. The Cardinal Virtues, which depicts true religion as undefiled as the virtues of fortitude, prudence, and temperance. And the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, a doctrinal dispute about the nature of the presence in the host, supposedly proving it to be so, standing in for the law. The final room, Stanza dell'Incendio del Borgo, whose eponymous fresco tells the story of a fire in a section of Rome called the Borgo, that was put out by the miraculous blessing of Pope Leo IV. He also won a great battle at the port of Rome, depicted in the Battle of Ostia, and went a long way in establishing the infallibility of the Pope when, accused of various charges of misconduct, was exonerated by all the cardinals, as shown in the Oath of Leo. Also included are the crowning of Charlemagne, celebrating the event that took place at Old St. Peter's on Christmas Day, AD 800. By now you may be getting close to the actual Sistine Chapel, so one more pointer before you enter. The ceiling is divided into several different parts. There are the Old Testament panels along the spine of the roof, the most famous. At the 4 corners of each of the panels are found the Ignudi. Between the Ignudi are a series of medallions. Adjoining the base of the ceiling are the portraits of the prophets and sibyls, also quite famous. In the corners are the 4 labors, and in the pendentives are the ancestors of Christ. This narration will at least touch on each of those items, with the exception of the medallions. There is very little written about these, except that they are scenes from the Old Testament and were probably painted by Michelangelo's staff. You can see the enlargements of these medallions and their titles in the accompanying slideshow. The first scriptural historical panel he completed was of the flood. When you see it, you'll have to squint to see the people and what they're doing. It was the master's one blunder. When he came down and saw from the ground what it looked like, he went back to the drawing board and re-visualized everything. All the other panels have depictions that can easily be seen and understood from the ground. By now, I hope you're comfortably seated and ready to get started looking at the scenes from the Old Testament. Perhaps, while reading this, or actually viewing the chapel itself, you might want to listen to a piece of music that was actually composed for this chapel. Gregory Allegri's Miserere Mei Deus. The panels are divided into 3 groups of 3 panels each. The creation is closest to the altar, Adam and Eve in the middle, and Noah and the flood at the far end. Most people would assume that the scenes progress in chronological order, but if you try to establish such an order, you might find a few panels out of place. Michelangelo painted it in the opposite order, and he meant it to be viewed in that order as well. I mean, if you're walking from creation to flood, you've either got to walk backwards or turn around for each panel. So, we're going to go from the end in which the paintings were oriented. Were you actually walking, you'd have to go through the screen And that's important. The screen divided the chapel into sections, where the laity could go and where the priests could go. If you look above you as you go through the screen, you'll note you're going into the post-Eden world of Noah. We start in the telestial and advance up toward the celestial. The three scenes in the Noah section depict the flood itself in the main panel, followed by the sacrifice of Noah and the drunkenness of Noah on either side. First, in the drunkenness of Noah, we see a naked Noah crouched on the floor where he has gone insensate after drinking too much wine from the large wine vat behind him. Ham, having discovered their errant father, has pointed him out to Shem and Japheth, who avert their gaze as they cover him with a cloth. The main action is being taken by Shem, who carefully averts his gaze, and from whose ancestry would ultimately come the Savior. By the way, that is also Noah off to the left, actually planting the vine from which the wine came. Like Don McLean's American Pie, for which there is no Rosetta Stone, Michelangelo left his story to speak for itself. But I like the interpretation by William Kloss, who calls these three panels the destruction, salvation, and second fall from grace. If you follow the panels from back leading toward the front, not in chronological order, one sees that we start in our own fallen state, victim of our own sins that we may have planted. As a result of our fallen state, we experience the calamities of the world. But if we stay within the confines of our own temple-like cubicle ark, we will be saved from the terrors of the world. We must then advance back to the altar of God, offering up the things of the world as sacrifice, although they may be tasty. Sorry for the missing piece of the latter panel. It's Napoleon's fault. Due to some military intrigues when he was invading Italy in 1797, the powder magazine at the Castel Sant'Angelo was blown up. Although the explosion was a mile away, it rocked the building, causing the small panel of fresco to fall to the ground. In the flood, the ark is depicted as a cubic temple-like structure in the background. In the middle, a rowboat is on its way out to the ark, but it is in the act of foundering due to too many people climbing in. There are two patches of high ground to which refugees are streaming, some carrying furniture and food, others carrying loved ones. My favorites are the old man carrying his dead son to the welcoming arms of the stone outcrop, but turning instead to gaze at the waters, perhaps considering the inevitability of his own demise. Also, in what could be seen as a precursor to the Sistine Madonna, a mother holds her child close, their only clothing being a rounded, billowing shawl over their heads. The third panel in this set is the sacrifice of Noah, a little easier to make out despite its smaller size. In the foreground, four men, I thought there were only Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are bringing two rams and an ox to sacrifice. Two men prepare the rams, one of which has had both its throat and belly cut open. In the dramatic focus of the scene, one man turns to offer the liver to his wife to put upon the altar as burnt sacrifice. Behind them, a man stoops to blow the fire, while another brings more wood. Behind the altar, one daughter-in-law is having some sort of disagreement with Noah and his wife, probably wondering why a perfectly good liver is going to be charred. But Noah points heavenward, noting the source of the blessings for which they are offering thanks, and the intended recipient of the gift. Now we cross through the screen, and we see the few lights come on to brighten the scene, and we hear, "We now enter the terrestrial world." Above us we see Adam and Eve in a triple scene all rolled into one, the temptation and expulsion. On the left side of the panel, there are leaves on the trees denoting Eden, although the rocks on the ground are a little stark. To the left is the cold, cruel world, devoid of anything but flat dirt. The first portion of the scene has Adam actively thrusting a finger at the tempter, "I will not partake." But a lovely, if overly muscled, reclining Eve reaches out to take the fruit from the surprisingly female serpentine temptress. On the right, a cherub thrusts a flameless sword toward the expelled couple. Adam shields his wife and his own gaze from the angel and Eden, while Eve takes it all in from a much less lovely face. Not too sure Michelangelo did his best work on that head. It seems to be detached from her neck and being propped up by the heel of her hand. This is the last panel in which God is not depicted. In the next scene, the creation of Eve, the poor Adam, although a more lively body than his coming creation panel, is passed out, propped up against a rock. Although we see no wound, note that Eve's right ankle appears as though it could be exiting Adam's ribs. There's Eve in the middle, not passively accepting her creation, but seemingly in an argument with God the Father. In his first appearance, God is patiently, if perturbedly, standing still, hearing and countering Eve's words. Adam sleeps through the whole thing. Did Eve receive counsel from God to which Adam was not privy? I love that Eve is actively talking to God while Adam sleeps. A timeless and apt contrast of the sexes on multiple levels. The next panel is, of course, the most famous of all Michelangelo's paintings, the creation of Adam. Before we go on to Adam, note two things about God. First, note that he's not patiently standing on earth, but actively flying or floating in the air. As we follow him further, he becomes more and more detached from the earth and in a hurry. Secondly, compare the color and shape of the protective veil covering him with that of the woman in the flood scene. I've heard no explanation of what that might mean, but I think it has something to do with the presence of the Spirit of God. God is surrounded by the sexless putti, who support and carry him. But I note the obviously feminine form under his left arm, who actively supports him. Is this Mrs. God? And note that she is here in the cocoon with him at the moment of creation, but absent in other panels. While God and company actively fly in heaven, a completely supine and inactive Adam lies on the barren earth. His action consists of perhaps raising an arm toward God, but still having to rest it on his knee. He's physically and sexually flaccid. He gazes like a distracted teenager, wondering what all the fuss is about, while God's gaze is pointedly, forcefully centered on the moment of creation that is so tantalizingly close. But do notice one thing we can finally take on good authority. Adam already has a belly button before the breath of life came to him. And now we approach the altar. Although the veil doesn't separate the compartments, we note the painted curtains to either side. Anything mortal now falls off, replaced alone by the eternal Father and the bare elements of creation. In the first panel, God, in his protective cocoon, supported by putti, waves his hands over his newly created earth, separating the land from the waters. And while earth is present, it is fading to insignificance in the lower portion. We are rising from the cares of mortal life to a more prominent blue of heaven. In the right scene of the creation of the sun and moon, God begins to emerge from his protective cocoon as he sternly and hurriedly creates the sun in front of him and the moon behind him. In the second scene, he flees the scene on his way to create plants. I don't know how you can have plants without dry land, so this one escapes me. And even though we can see the shape of God's hinder parts, although to a colorblind person it is not easily discernible, the color of his cheeks matches his robes, not his heels. What reference this may have to Exodus 33, 22, and 23 is unexplained. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passes by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away mine hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. I like the putti in this one. The two in the back wrap up as if for sleep in the moonlight, while the one directly under the sun shades his eyes. The fourth eagerly regards the master at creation, as if he will someday have the chance to do it himself. In the final panel, it comes down to the basics. God divides the light from darkness. No putti, just a twisting, totally involved creator fighting to separate the primal forces. By the time he painted this scene, Michelangelo knew exactly what he was doing. He painted the entire panel in one day. God is seen from below, What first appears as a very distorted face is actually his strained and detailed neck and Adam's apple. Look again and find his left nostril poking out over beard and wisps of hair crowned by the focus of the light. Michelangelo's friend and biographer said of this panel, "Furthermore, to demonstrate the perfection of his art and the greatness of God, Michelangelo depicted God dividing light from darkness in these scenes where he is seen in all his majesty as he sustains himself alone with open arms with a demonstration of love and creative energy." And thus, having entered the presence of God alone, we finish the Old Testament panels. The Ignudi. Michelangelo never married. We don't even hear of him having lady friends. He did, however, have many male friends. And as you can tell from his art, his nude men are athletic and attractive, where most of his women look like men with long hair, and as my mother said after seeing the tombs of the Medici in Firenze, like men with cantaloupes on their chest. Did Michelangelo suffer from same-sex attraction? Very probably. Did he ever act on it? Unlike most other known homosexuals, Michelangelo was not a practicing one. Whether he experimented as a youth is his own business, but we know that in his adult life, he was a sincerely devout, pious, and abstinent man. Nevertheless, he gloried in the nude male figure, but probably not that way. In the newfound philosophy of the Renaissance, God was too far off and unattainable. It was difficult or impossible for man to measure up to his standard, and so man became the measure of all things. See the Vitruvian man. And man ought to try to perfect what he could, and not strive to attain the ineffable. What's the purpose of the Ignudi? There are many explanations posited by experts online, but nothing rings very true to me, other than that they are mortal men who, in twists and turns, waking from sleep or drifting off to slumber, are observing and trying to understand and come closer to the ways of God. Since our eyes have wandered back to the front of the chapel, it's probably time to stand to take in the full force of the final judgment. Unlike in the film The Agony and the Ecstasy, Michelangelo was not immediately engaged to paint the west wall of the chapel. It wasn't until some 24 years after finishing this ceiling that he got to it. But in the meantime, something awful had happened in the world, and it needed to be corrected. Martin Luther and his ilk had initiated the Reformation, which seemed to the Catholics to represent an everyone wins attitude like some scorn today. The Church wanted to reiterate that not only were they the ones with the keys to the kingdom, but awful judgment awaited any who did not toe the line. And so this great work was commissioned as a backdrop to the location where the Pope was chosen. The first thing to note is the mass of naked flesh everywhere. After a preview of the painting was granted to the Vatican staff, the Master of Ceremonies, Biagio de Cesena, said that, quote, "It was most dishonest in such an honored place to have painted so many nude figures who so dishonestly show their shame," unquote, and that it was, quote, "not a work for the chapel of the Pope, but for taverns," unquote. To shame him in return, Michelangelo painted him in the bottom right corner, naked and ass ears, and a serpent devouring his privates. But he was not alone in his condemnation, and after Michelangelo was dead and gone, Daniele de Volterra was engaged to paint covering drapery on the most offensive figures. For this, he was derided by other artists as the man who put the pants on. However, if you step back from the public privates and note the quality of the nude bodies, especially with an LDS perspective, one might get a different idea. 3 things to consider. First, our garments were given to us to cover our nakedness, but man in his innocent state was naked. Could not nakedness then infer a return to our pre-earth state? Second, these naked bodies are in no way lithe and seductive. Every single body is over-muscled, some grotesquely so. To a man trying to depict a resurrected body with the power of immortality, how else could he have done it? Finally, although the rest of the Christian world envisions sexless angels flying through heaven, Michelangelo believed our sexuality would be retained. You might have seen that in the statue of Christ the Redeemer in St. Maria sopra Minerva, that glorious statue so ruined by the brass loincloth. So instead of looking at these figures as anything but lewd, we should consider them in their primeval state, glorified, and sexed for all eternity. With that, I have singled out a few things for you to consider as you try to take in this massive painting that took 5 years to paint. The trumpets. Starting at the middle bottom, note the trumpets that signal the end of the world. I'm not sure which one is Moroni, but man, those two big guys are blowing their guts out. Note also that the books are being opened from which the dead shall be judged. The one for the damned is a whole lot bigger than the one for the blessed. The instruments of the Passion. If you let your eye jump to the top, you'll note a collection of instruments used to bring about the atonement. These include the cross and the crown of thorns, but also the pillar to which Jesus was chained when he was scourged. The men versus the woman. Although with Buonarroti it is hard to tell sometimes, if you note closely the two crowds of people to the left and right of the main scene, you'll note that many of the ones on the right side have breasts, while none of those on the left do. I'm not sure what Michelangelo meant by this division, so I'll leave it to you to speculate. Women on the left, men on the right. But the one thing I do note is that there are 2 instances where men are eagerly greeting each other with kisses and embraces, while none of the women deign to do this. The saints. Depicted in the drawing are at least 7 saints that we can recognize from the accoutrements they carry. This massive figure on Christ's right is John the Baptist, identifiable by the camel hair garments clinging to him. To his left is St. Andrew, who was crucified on an X-shaped cross. In the next group, at the Savior's feet, are St. Lawrence, who was barbecued on a grill, and St. Bartholomew, who was flayed alive. Everybody remarks that the skin hanging from Bartholomew's hand has the face of Michelangelo, and come up with all sorts of mumbo-jumbo about its placement, lightly dangling from Bartholomew's fingers, about to drop into hell. But it's hard to see a resemblance to any one person in such a carnival mirror face. In the third group, the only recognizable person is that of Peter, handing over the keys of the kingdom to the Lord. I'm glad I don't have to carry those keys around in my pocket. Some also conjecture that the man directly behind him is St. Paul. And the handsome blonde floating over them, some think that's St. John the Beloved. The final group of saints includes St. Catherine, now fully clothed, thanks to the censors, carrying the wheel upon which she was broken, St. Sebastian displaying the many arrows with which he was pierced, and St. Blaise, who was assaulted with iron combs or rakes with which he was tortured. The big man with the cross? Perhaps the good thief, or Simon of Cyrene, who helped carry the cross. The Terrors of the Damned. Unforgettable in its horror of monsters and torture, a boatload of evildoers arrives on the quay of the river Styx, where they are sent flying to the bank by Charon's paddle. Some are also offloaded by a demon's pitchfork. The devil himself can be seen emerging from the glowing inferno behind the scene. Some try their best to climb up to the realm of the blessed, but are brutally repulsed by men and angels. The redemption of the dead. On the opposite corner, the dead are depicted coming from their graves at the sound of the last trumpet, crawling out from under the ground or just rising from fallen bodies. The embodied souls of the dead begin their rise into heaven. When I look at this, I see women from above reaching down with all their might to pull these people into heaven. A Catholic interpretation has souls being lifted from purgatory with the prayers of the living as depicted by the rosary to which the dead cling. But I see this as a foreshadowing of the great work of family history and temple work. And if the bodies weren't so dang unclothed, would gladly use them in Sunday school class. While some are haunted by this monster or that, or the flayed skin dangling over the pits of hell, I think the scariest and most thought-provoking image of all of them is what has been dubbed as the damned soul, the one covering half his face with his hand and gazing out at us. I'd like to add a cross-reference for that, Mosiah 4:30. But this much I can tell you. that if you do not watch yourselves and your thoughts and your words and your deeds, and observe the commandments of God, and continue in the faith of what ye have heard concerning the coming of our Lord, even unto the end of your lives, ye must perish. And now, O man, remember, and perish not. And finally, we come to the center point of the whole scene, the great judge to whom has been delivered the keys, who has earned his positions by the instruments of his passion, who reads the names out of the books, who perhaps hears the pleas of the saints and martyrs. Of course, in Catholic tradition, Mary sits near him, but in this final scene, she's powerless to whisper in his ear, leaving the great task of judgment to him and to him alone. His naked body, previously unadorned by coverings, is the envy of bodybuilders everywhere, displaying the might and power of his eternal and everlasting nature. The prophets and sibyls, ancestors and heroes. It's soon time to exit the chapel, but let's take a look at the items on the second and third levels of the ceiling. The largest, intended like the annuity to be three-dimensional action figures, included 5 sibyls and 7 prophets. The 5 sibyls were said to have foretold the birth of a Savior. The prophecies by pagan prophetesses were accepted by Christians as being fulfilled with the birth of Christ. The pendentives in the 4 corners contain depictions of heroes who at one time or another contributed to the salvation of the chosen people when they were in dire straits. In keeping with the balance of the sexes, the corners alternate between male and female heroes. The lunettes over each of the windows contains the names of the ancestors of Christ. There used to be 2 more of them on the front wall, but when Michelangelo created the Last Judgment, he had those 2 covered over. Some have 1 name, some have 2, some have 3, but none of them tries to depict the persons named, else Jesus might have had been darker complected than we assume. The spandrels between the lunettes depict the travails of motherhood. The first one is a mom-to-be closing her eyes, dreaming, dreading. In 2 others, the mother tries to lead or teach her child, but in all the rest, it just seems she's exhausted, and the lounging, shadowy father isn't ever of much help. Hero, Moses and the bronze serpent. With real snakes attacking people everywhere, a crowded scene recalling the masked figures in the flood scene parts to reveal the bronze serpent raised up on a rod. The prophet Jonah. Just having come out of the darkness of the belly of the whale, that looks more like a big sturgeon, he cranes his neck to see God separating light from darkness. A hero, Esther and Haman. The king, who is going over his books during a sleepless night, realizes something is amiss. Esther, discovering the plot, denounces Haman, and her husband orders his execution on a scaffold he has built. We see Haman crucified, with Esther looking at him from a doorway, the king giving orders in the background. The Libyan Sibyl, with Hellenic figures and an elegant and dramatic twist, turns to open her book containing the prophecy of the coming of a king born to a virgin. The prophet Jeremiah. Shown in deep and heavy sorrow for the loss of Jerusalem, he broods over the seat where the Pope would sit, perhaps feeling the weight of leading a reluctant church. The prophet Daniel, who prophesied of Christ long before his coming, has his head turned directly to the picture of the Savior on a wall that would not be painted with that figure for 30 years. The Persian Sibyl, dressed in an Arab turban and looking over her shoulder at some definitely Arab associates, depicts Sabe, the prophetess of Hebrew origin among the Persians. The Cumaean Sibyl, not someone you'd want to meet in a dark alley, or broad daylight for that matter. She was from the area of Napoli. She sold books to King Tarquin that were kept and consulted for hundreds of years, one prophecy of which appeared to be messianic. The prophet Ezekiel, looking toward the fallen state of man, he tries to explain to them the importance of the Scriptures, holding in his left hand the stick of Ephraim. The prophet Isaiah, placed directly over the screen that divides fallen man from the garden, he holds his book of prophecy regarding the coming of the Messiah. The Erythraean Sibyl, from a town on the west coast of Turkey, whom St. Augustine quotes at great length, says that she certainly wrote some things concerning Christ which are quite manifest. I'm not quite sure what her putti is doing, but it looks like it involves fire. The Delphic Sibyl, from Delphi, the most famous oracle of them all. She inspired Socrates to quest for knowledge, which helped him bring about the conditions for the Johannic Restoration. The prophet Joel, who said that both sons and daughters, youth and old men, should have visions and prophesy, is important in this building, depicting young Daniel and the female Sibyls. The hero Judith and Holofernes. From the apocryphal book of Judith, it depicts the woman who got herself invited into the Syrian general's tent as he besieged her hometown. She got him drunk and then chopped off his head, carrying it in a basket out to show the rest of the army, who turned and fled. The prophet Zacharias, who prophesied, "Behold, your king comes to you, humble and riding on a donkey," is posted directly over the door through which the Pope is carried in on procession on Palm Sunday. David and Goliath, a pretty simple depiction of a well-known and dramatic event, which Michelangelo had captured so memorably in marble. Note the hints of the armored soldiers in the shadows behind the tent. Also note here that the giant is not down for the count, but struggles to rise as David delivers the coup de grace. Although I haven't mentioned any of the family portraits up to this point, I will make note of the ones calling out Jacob and Joseph. That would be Joseph, the father of Jesus, or the husband of Mary, and I don't think this painting tries to depict either of those persons. Now the time has come to take one last look down the length of the Sistine Chapel. Take one last glance at the famous fingers of God and Adam. Note one more time the joys and sorrows that are called to mind by the final judgment. See Christ once more, powerful and just in his judgment, and perhaps let your eye linger for the last moment on the poor damned soul awaiting his judgment. And you too remember, O man, and perish not. This concludes the McGregor's Travel Adventures Vatican Museums audio tour. As you make your long way out of the museum, if you have any tolerance for artwork left, enjoy the many works on your way out. But if you've had enough, make a beeline for the exit. My neighbor tells me there's a very good gelateria just across the street from the entrance. Go ahead. You deserve a little cooling pleasure after experiencing the flames of hell. But don't eat too much. You've got to maintain that Apollo of Belvedere figure,